The algorithm insisted the mountain was empty, but that is the problem with spreadsheets. They cannot feel the stone humming beneath your fingertips. Beatrice stands at the mouth of the mine, while the wind slices through her thin coat, and her breath hangs in the grey morning light like wood smoke. Only 6 weeks ago, the corporation discarded her because she was redundant, a word that really meant she was too expensive and far too human. She possessed the kind of intuition their data models could never calculate, and now she is standing before the worthless hole in the ground they all laughed at. Her grandfather left her this place like a cruel joke, but as she stares into the mouth of the mountain, she is ready to prove that the machines are blind. The timber frame looms against a bruised winter sky, dark and weathered, exhaling a draught of cold air that feels like the breath of something sleeping. The wood is splinter rough beneath her palms, and rust stains her skin a deep orange where she touches the old iron bolts. The smell of the place hits her first, a heavy mix of damp earth and something much older, a mineral-rich scent that feels ancient and heavy. She steps across the threshold into the darkness, and the temperature drops so fast the cold clings to her skin like wet clothes. Somewhere deeper in the shaft, water drips in a slow rhythm that echoes off the jagged stone walls, marking time in a silence that feels absolute. Everything she once relied on is gone, from her high-rise office to the reputation she spent a decade building, all stripped away by people who valued numbers over eyes. This mine was dismissed by every expert in the industry because their software said there was nothing left to find. Yet it holds a secret no machine could ever detect. The question pulls her deeper into the shadows. What happens when the expert they threw away finally finds the treasure they were too arrogant to see? 3 weeks before she stood at that entrance, Beatrice was sitting in a conference room on the 32nd floor of a glass building that felt more like a tomb than an office. The mining corporation had hired her 5 years ago when she was a geologist with a string of published research and the kind of field expertise that actually mattered. They gave her a title and a corner office with a salary that allowed her to breathe without counting every dollar in her bank account. Then the market shifted as rare earth minerals flooded in from overseas, causing extraction costs to rise and the company's profit margins to thin. Suddenly, the only metric that mattered to the board of directors was efficiency, and a human being with an opinion was no longer efficient. The layoffs arrived on a Tuesday morning without a single warning or a moment of negotiation to acknowledge everything she had contributed to the firm. She was met by a human resources representative who spoke with the practiced sympathy of someone who had delivered the same script 100 times that day. Her severance package amounted to exactly 3 months of silence, a small cushion of cash meant to last until the bills started screaming for attention. Because she was the last one hired, she was the first one pushed out the door, and her years of credentials meant nothing compared to the automation they'd invested in. The decision had been finalized long before she ever walked into that room, leaving her to pack her life into a single cardboard box. She spent the next 2 weeks trapped in her apartment with the lights off, staring at the ceiling and the growing stack of unopened mail on her kitchen counter. Every job listing she found required niche skills she hadn't used in years, and the rejections started hitting her inbox with a speed that felt personal. She was told she was overqualified or underqualified, but the underlying message was always the same. She was too expensive for a world that wanted cheap labor. The industry had decided she was disposable, and when the world makes a judgment like that, it is rarely interested in changing its mind. Then, a cream-colored envelope arrived in the mail, addressed in her grandfather's handwriting, which looked shaky and deliberate across the front. She almost tossed it aside, because her grandfather had been dead for 4 years, and she wasn't ready to deal with ghosts while her own life was falling apart. The letter had been sitting in a lawyer's office, waiting for a specific set of instructions, and inside was a deed to a property she hadn't thought about since she was a child. It was a mine tucked away in the jagged peaks of the northern mountains, a place her grandfather had worked and failed at, leaving it to her like a burden wrapped in legal paper. The letter admitted that the mine had never turned a profit, and because no appraiser would touch it, no bank would ever dream of financing its development. It was a liability and a physical reminder of a dead man's broken dreams, a literal hole in the ground that swallowed hope and gave nothing back. Her family had always treated the location like a family secret you don't mention at dinner, the kind of inheritance that most people would have refused immediately. But Beatrice realized she had nowhere else to go, and with her severance disappearing and her apartment lease ending in 6 weeks, she was facing a total erasure. The mine wasn't a choice or a grand adventure. It was a desperate grab at survival when every other door had been slammed in her face. She packed her car 3 days later, shoving everything she owned into the back seat and leaving the rest of her life on the sidewalk. She didn't look back at the city as she drove toward the mountains, clutching a deed for a place the world had already written off as worthless. What she didn't know yet was that the stone was waiting for her, and she was about to prove that the world was wrong. The drive lasted 8 hours, a long stretch where the landscape slowly shed the skin of the city and traded it for something much older. As the buildings thinned out, the trees grew dense, and the sky seemed to crack wide open, reclaiming the horizon. By the time she finally reached the turnoff, civilization felt like a fading memory in the rearview mirror, replaced by a world that remembered what the earth looked like before we paved over it. The property didn't show itself all at once. She had to navigate a gravel road that hadn't seen a grader in years, a path so rutted and broken that it forced her to crawl along as if she were approaching something fragile. When the clearing finally opened up, the mine entrance stood exactly as she remembered it from her childhood. The timber frame was grey with age and neglect, standing like a mouth frozen mid-scream, exhaling a draft of cold air that she could feel pressing against the car windows. She sat there for a long minute, with her hands still white-knuckled on the steering wheel, knowing that stepping out meant there was no turning back. Once she crossed that threshold and descended into the dark, the life she had built would be officially over. There would be no returning to the apartment, no corporate headhunters calling her back, and no more waiting for a boss to finally recognize her worth. There was only the mine, the biting cold, and whatever secrets were waiting in the silence below. The air hit her the moment she opened the door, sharp and thin with the heavy scent of rust and wet stone. Her breath turned to mist in the grey light as she reached out to touch the timber frame, feeling the splinters of wood that had weathered down to the colour of old bone. Rust bloomed across the metal supports like a slow-moving disease, staining her fingertips in shades of orange and deep red as she traced the skeleton of the entrance. The floor of the shaft sloped gently downward, and with every step she took, the daylight surrendered a little more to the deepening shadows. As her eyes adjusted, the walls began to reveal their history through bands of grey, purple, and charcoal stone. This was her native tongue, the only language that had ever made sense to her, where the rock spoke through its texture and composition. Most people never learned how to listen, but to her, the stone told a story of its age, its birth, and every trauma it had endured over millions of years. The deeper she went, the more the humidity clung to her skin like a damp shroud. The temperature seemed to drop 5 degrees for every 10 steps she took, making the air feel heavy and dense, almost like she was trying to breathe underwater. Somewhere in the distance, water dripped in a steady, hypnotic rhythm that echoed off the stone like a heartbeat. It was a constant reminder that the mountain was still alive, moving and breathing, even though the rest of the world had forgotten this place existed. She kept her hand against the wall as she moved, feeling the geological layers shift beneath her palm, from smooth, cold surfaces to rough, crystalline edges. Decades ago, the previous owners had walked these same paths, but they had only tested the obvious seams before walking away. They were satisfied with their quick judgments and confident that the mine was worthless, but they had never truly looked. They hadn't gone deep enough to hear what the stone was actually trying to say. Eventually, the narrow shaft opened into a massive chamber where the darkness was so thick her flashlight could barely cut through it. The walls climbed higher than the beam could reach, disappearing into a void of shadow above her head. The floor was a graveyard of abandoned effort, scattered with broken tools and rock fragments left behind by men who decided the struggle wasn't worth the reward. This was the exact spot where they gave up, leaving the mountain to reclaim its silence. That first night, she set up her camp near the entrance, rolling out a sleeping bag and lighting a battery-powered lantern that sent shadows dancing across the jagged walls. The cold seeped into her bones, and she lay there listening to the mine breathe, feeling the staggering weight of the mountain over her head. She was living inside the earth now, tucked away in a place the world had written off as dead, waiting for the stone to tell her its first secret. Morning light reached into the shaft like a pale, thin hand, but it only made it a few feet before the darkness swallowed it whole. Beatrice woke up with a body that felt stiff and heavy from the cold, watching her own breath cloud the air as she crawled out of her sleeping bag. She brewed coffee on a small camp stove, clutching the warm cup as the only real comfort in the world, and then she began the slow, methodical work of a woman with nothing left to lose. She moved with the precision of a specialist, using the skills that once made her a star at the corporation before they decided she was an overhead cost. Her kit was simple: a rock hammer, a magnifying glass, and heavy cloth sample bags, along with a portable spectrometer she had forgotten to return when she was let go. The device was the size of a thick book and ran on batteries, but it was the only thing that could bridge the gap between a lucky guess and a scientific fact. The old surveys of this mine had been lazy and superficial. The men who came before her had only scratched the surface, testing the easy spots and walking away the moment the minerals weren't handed to them on a silver platter. Beatrice knew better than to trust a quick glance, understanding that the most valuable things in this world don't announce themselves. They hide in the deep, requiring a level of patience and expertise that most people aren't willing to give. She studied the patterns on the wall with an intensity that couldn't be replaced by an algorithm, looking for the tiny details that only a human eye could catch. A subtle shift in color caught her attention, a thin band of deep purple-gray cutting through the standard granite like a hidden vein. She ran her fingers over the change in texture, feeling a spark of recognition, because she knew the stone was finally starting to talk back. Every sample she took was marked with her initials and the date, her handwriting neat and steady in a notebook that documented every inch of her progress. As the days blurred together, she moved deeper into the mountain, her lantern casting long, flickering shadows that followed her like ghosts. Her body grew stronger with the physical labor, and her mind felt sharper than it had in years, honed by the singular focus of the hunt. The biting cold eventually started to feel familiar, almost like a comfort, because it meant the minerals down here were preserved and untouched by the world above. She found herself talking out loud to the rock, her voice bouncing off the damp walls and mixing with the sound of dripping water. This wasn't the kind of isolation that led to loneliness. It was a rare kind of clarity, where the entire universe narrowed down to her, the stone, and the truth. A week into her search, she stumbled upon a secondary chamber that had branched off from the main shaft, a space that had been missed by every previous survey. The walls here were different, glowing with rich colors and crystalline structures that caught her lantern light like shattered glass. Her hands began to shake as she hammered away at the rock, realizing she was standing in a place that hadn't been touched by a human being in a generation. She fed the samples into her spectrometer and held her breath while the machine translated the stone into a string of digital numbers. The screen flickered with data, suggesting the presence of rare earth minerals like neodymium and dysprosium, the very elements that power the modern world. These were the same minerals the corporation had spent millions trying to find overseas, the same ones they claimed were too expensive to mine here. She ran the test again, and then a third time, terrified that she was just seeing what she desperately wanted to see. But the numbers remained steady, and the machine didn't lie about the chemistry of the earth. The stone was telling her the absolute truth, revealing that this worthless hole in the ground was actually a treasure chest. It was a legacy buried in the grime, something that everyone else had missed, and something that only she was qualified to find. Beatrice knew that a gut feeling wouldn't be enough to bring a billion-dollar corporation to its knees. She couldn't just walk into a glass-walled office with a handful of dirt and a theory, because she had already learned how easily they could look right through her. To make them listen, she needed the kind of cold, hard evidence that left no room for debate. She needed peer-reviewed proof that would turn her suspicion into an undeniable reality. She spent the evening wrapping her samples in soft cloth, nesting them into a padded box with the kind of care usually reserved for fragile glass. The drive to the university took 4 long hours, ending at a geology department that smelled of sulfur, damp earth, and ancient stone. It was a place where people still respected the secrets hidden in the crust of the earth, and she carried her box through the halls like it held something sacred. The lab technician looked up from his desk and recognized her name from her old research papers, but his expression immediately shifted into a look of quiet pity. It was the kind of look that stings more than being ignored, a silent acknowledgement of her fall from grace that suggested she was someone to be felt sorry for. Beatrice didn't bother to correct his assumptions, choosing instead to leave her samples behind before driving back to the silence of the mine to wait. A week later, the results were ready for pickup, and she found herself sitting in her car with the folder in her lap, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was terrified that she'd imagined the whole thing, that she was just a desperate woman seeing patterns in the dirt because she had nothing else left. But when she finally pulled the pages out, the data was even better than she'd hoped, showing massive concentrations of neodymium and dysprosium. These weren't just random traces. They were high-purity rare earth elements that were worth thousands of dollars for every single kilogram she could pull from the ground. She sat in that parking lot and read the report 3 times, her eyes blurring as the weight of her new reality finally started to sink in. This meant more than just money in the bank. It was a total vindication of her life's work, and a way to move forward without ever having to beg for a job again. The corporation hadn't just been wrong to fire her. They had been completely blind to the fortune sitting right under their noses. They'd had the deed, they'd had her expertise, and they'd thrown both away just to make their quarterly spreadsheets look a little cleaner. But as the initial rush of triumph faded, a new kind of pressure settled over her, because she knew that this discovery made her a target. She couldn't just start digging and selling to the highest bidder without a plan, or she'd end up as a pawn for the same people who had discarded her. If she wasn't careful, the very thing that was supposed to save her would turn into a cage, drawing the attention of predators who specialized in taking what didn't belong to them. The drive back to the mountain happened under a pitch-black sky, with her headlights cutting through the gloom like a silver blade. When she reached the entrance, the old timber frame looked like a jagged tooth against the stars, guarding a darkness that felt absolute and heavy. She stood at the mouth of the shaft and let out a breath, tasting the cold air on her tongue and realizing it didn't feel like a tomb anymore. It tasted like a second chance, like the world was finally admitting that she had been right all along. She stepped into the tunnel, and the familiar dampness of the cave wrapped around her shoulders like a heavy wool coat. The stone had been whispering the truth to her for months, and now she finally had the papers to prove she wasn't crazy. The mine wasn't a dead end. and she wasn't a failure, and every person who had written her off was about to find out just how expensive their mistake really was. With the lab reports tucked away, Beatrice returned to the secondary chamber with a sense of purpose that felt more like a fever. She wasn't just a scavenger anymore. She was an architect of her own rescue, methodically carving out the proof of her survival. Every hour spent in the dirt was a brick in a wall of evidence that no corporate lawyer or skeptical surveyor could ever hope to tear down. The physical toll of the work was brutal, leaving her muscles screaming and her lungs burning with every breath of the thin, freezing air. She swung the pick with a rhythmic, deliberate force, making sure to extract the rock in large, clean sections that preserved the delicate mineral structures inside. As she pushed further into the rock face, the vein didn't just continue, it widened, showing a scale that suggested this was a massive geological event rather than a lucky pocket. In the dim glow of her lantern, the purple-grey ore seemed to shimmer with a dull, internal light, promising the kind of wealth that could change a person's DNA. She became a ghost in the machine, documenting every inch of the progress with the obsessive detail of a crime scene investigator. She took hundreds of photos, mapped the dimensions of the walls, and filled notebooks with sketches that tracked how the mineral concentration grew richer the deeper she went. This was her case file against the world that had rejected her, a mountain of data proving that she saw things others couldn't. She was documenting the exact moment the experts had failed, and she was doing it with a precision they could never hope to match. One Tuesday afternoon, the mountain decided to remind her who was really in charge when a sharp crack echoed through the chamber and the floor beneath her boots gave a sickening shudder. She froze, her pulse thumping in her ears as she realized how close she was to being buried alive in a hole that no one knew she was in. The silence that followed was heavy and terrifying, a reminder that the mind could turn from a sanctuary into a grave in the blink of an eye. She didn't ignore the warning, spending the next 3 days hauling heavy timber to shore up the ceiling and stabilize the most dangerous sections of the wall. She worked slower after that, respecting the ancient weight of the stone above her head, but she never once considered walking away from the riches she'd found. The mountain was patient and indifferent, but she was determined to take what it was offering, moving with a cautious grace that only comes from knowing exactly what you have to lose. As she dug deeper, she began to understand why the men who came before her had walked away with empty pockets. They had been looking for the easy wins, the surface-level seams that announced themselves with bright colors and obvious paths. But this treasure required a different kind of sight, the kind that only comes from years of study and the willingness to crawl into the places that everyone else is too afraid to touch. It was the kind of work that couldn't be done by a machine or a cheap contractor, requiring a human touch and a desperate heart to find the hidden path. By the time the last of the winter snow began to melt, she had mapped the entire extent of the deposit and gathered enough samples to fill a small warehouse. The evidence was now a physical weight, a mountain of proof that this worthless hole in the ground was actually one of the most valuable sites in the region. She was the only person on the planet who knew the truth, the only one who had listened when the earth started talking, and the only one brave enough to follow the sound. She stood in the center of the chamber one final evening, watching the lantern light dance across the glowing walls of the deep vein. She had taken a place that the world had left for dead and breathed life back into it, using nothing but her own 2 hands and the refusal to be forgotten. She had descended into a darkness that terrified everyone else, and in that blackness, she had found the light she needed to see her way home. The stone had been waiting for her since the beginning of time, holding its breath until someone with the right kind of scars came along to claim it. It had waited for someone who knew the value of things that are buried, someone who wouldn't take no for an answer. She wasn't just standing in a mine anymore. She was standing in the center of her own vindication, and for the first time in years, The silence felt like peace. Spring arrived with a heavy, reluctant crawl as the snow retreated toward the jagged peaks and the skeletal trees finally remembered the color green. When Beatrice finally stepped out of the mine into the early March sunlight, the glare felt like a physical blow, foreign and hostile after her months of living in the shadows. Her skin had faded to a ghostly, translucent pale, and her hands were a map of thick calluses and jagged scars earned from the stone. By now, her entire body had synchronized with the deep cold and the rhythmic, dripping silence of the isolation. The world above ground suddenly felt far too bright and aggressively loud, teeming with people and the suffocating weight of the life decisions she could no longer outrun. She began reaching out to mining companies to share her findings, but she moved with a quiet, calculated caution, knowing that her data was the only leverage she had left. Instead of walking into glass-walled corporate offices or sending cold emails to CEOs, she sought out smaller operations and ethical outfits that valued the land as much as the profit. She sent these teams her full geological surveys and the documented evidence of the vein's massive composition, along with a simple, haunting message. Her note just asked if they were interested in talking about a discovery she had made, and the response from the industry was almost instantaneous and incredibly intense. Soon, the quiet mountain was crawling with representatives, geologists, and business strategists in expensive parkas who looked visibly miserable in the biting high-altitude cold. Beatrice led them through the dark tunnels of her survey, watching their eyes go wide in the beam of her flashlight as they realized the sheer scale of the secondary chamber. They ran their own frantic tests on her samples and verified every single line of the data she had spent a lonely winter recording. Once the truth of the find was undeniable, the offers started pouring in, and the numbers they quoted were enough to change a life forever. The money on the table meant she would never have to shiver through another winter or count her last few dollars in a grocery store aisle just to survive. However, every one of those massive offers came with a jagged hook, requiring her to sign away every right to the land and become a mere employee again. She realized that once they had sucked the expertise from her brain and the minerals from the earth, she would be just as disposable as she was the day she was fired. History was threatening to repeat itself in a cycle of exploitation, and she knew that if she signed, she would eventually be used up and discarded just like before. She turned down the first 3 offers without a second thought. Refusing to be a pawn, she started hunting for partnerships and cooperative ownership models that would allow her to keep her hands on the wheel of her own destiny. She eventually found a small operation out of Colorado, run by a woman named Margaret, who had clawed her own company out of the dirt and understood exactly what it felt like to be dismissed. They sat and talked for hours, while Margaret listened to the entire story of the winter in the mine without once checking her watch or interrupting. It was clear that Margaret understood this wasn't just a play for more money, but a fight for ownership and the refusal to let the world steal her labor ever again. The negotiations that followed were slow and protective, with both women treating the deal like a fragile thing that needed to be handled with absolute precision. Beatrice fought for strict environmental safeguards and a permanent seat at the table during the extraction process, ensuring her terms reflected the true value of her sacrifice. She had learned the hard way that survival wasn't just about stumbling onto a pile of gold, but about having the strength to protect it once you did. The final agreement took months of debating every single clause until the contract finally mirrored the respect she had earned from the mountain itself. The extraction process began in the late spring, and Beatrice was there every single morning to oversee the heavy equipment as it groaned up the narrow mountain pass. She refused to simply hand over the keys and walk away, choosing instead to stand at the mine's mouth as the crews began the delicate work of piercing the vein. Because she had spent months in that suffocating darkness, she knew the fracture lines and the hidden pressure points of the stone better than any computer model ever could. The company engineers had no choice but to listen to her because she was the only living person who understood the temperament of that specific mountain. The vein gave up exactly what she had promised, yielding rare earth minerals in concentrations that proved every one of her shivering midnight calculations was correct. The money that flowed in was enough to wipe away her debts and turn her terrifying, uncertain future into a wide-open landscape of genuine possibility. But the financial win was secondary to the fact that she had finally reclaimed the legacy her grandfather had lost to the shadows decades ago. He had left her this mine as a heavy burden of failure, but she had transformed that broken dream into a legitimate, thriving inheritance. Even after the main work was done, she kept a small section of the tunnels for herself as a private sanctuary where she could still hear the mountain breathe. The isolation that had once felt like a prison sentence now felt like a home, and she returned on the weekends to map the deeper geology that the commercial crews ignored. Down there in the quiet, she was the one in total control, and her expertise was the only currency that mattered in the face of the ancient stone. She eventually published a paper titled Hidden Veins: Why Surface Assessment Fails, detailing the exact methods she used to see what the rest of the world had missed. The geological community was stunned by her findings, and soon the same universities that wouldn't look at her resume were begging her to come and teach their graduate students. She was suddenly a person of immense value again, but she negotiated her new life with the same ironclad boundaries she used for the mining contract. She took on one university class and a few consulting gigs for companies that shared her soul, but she kept the rest of her time strictly for herself. Most of her days were spent in the cabin her grandfather had built, living in the very spot where he had once dreamed of a fortune he wasn't equipped to find. By the time the next winter began to settle into the valley, Beatrice had completely rebuilt her career on a foundation that no corporate executive could ever kick out from under her. The mine was never actually worthless, but it had been waiting for someone with the patience to listen to what the rocks were trying to say. Standing at the entrance a year after she first arrived, she watched the sky turn the color of a deep bruise as the first heavy flakes of snow began to fall. The biting cold felt like a familiar friend, and behind her, the dark shaft of the mine remained open and rich with secrets, waiting for the next person brave enough to go deep. Stay with us as we uncover the justice hidden in the dust. The cold walls of the mine taught Beatrice that what the world calls worthless is often just a matter of blindness. People discard treasures every day because they don't have the eyes to see them, but she refused to let their dismissal define her reality. What truly saved her wasn't the value of the minerals, but rather her stubborn refusal to accept someone else's judgment over her own expertise. She descended into that heavy darkness and emerged clutching a truth that no one else could see. And that single choice changed everything. If you want to see what happens when a person trusts their own soul over the world's noise, subscribe to the channel. The story of survival is always a story of going deeper.